Hi, everyone. My name is Ken Woods, and I'm the artistic director of Colorado Mahlerfest. Amongst the many things we're looking forward to at this year's festival, high on the list is Act One of Wagner's opera Die Walküre. Richard Wagner was one of the most important composers of all time, a composer who literally transcended music. He was a political activist, he was a writer, and he was also a completely and utterly awful human being. So what do we do with the legacy of an important artist and historical figure who is so deeply unlikable? Should we still be performing his music today? First, we'll talk a little bit about who Wagner was, why he was a horrible person, and what the issues are for us in performing his music today. I'll talk a little bit about the importance of his legacy, both musical and philosophical. And then at the end, I'll propose some thoughts about how we deal with these conflicting instincts to celebrate the music and to loathe the man. When we discuss Wagner as a person, the first thing that comes to mind is his virulent and repulsive anti-Semitism. It's a horrible stain on his character, but it is only one of many. In fact, Wagner was a horrible human being on almost every level you can contemplate. You might recognize his personality profile from recent descriptions of world leaders who we describe as narcissists or sociopaths. For Wagner, anything that advanced his cause in life was just, fair, and right. He ruthlessly exploited every friend, every colleague, every acquaintance for his own gain, completely without guilt. He betrayed those who helped him. He undermined those who rivaled him. There is almost nothing positive to say about Wagner as a human being. Before we come to the subject of his anti-Semitism, let me just outline some of the levels on which he was a small-minded, petty, devious, manipulative person. We know, for instance, that Wagner wrote disparagingly about Mendelssohn in particular, using anti-Semitic language to describe Mendelssohn's supposed failures as a composer. But part of this is because he viewed Mendelssohn and also Meyerbeer as rivals. Meyerbeer was the great French operatic composer of the generation before Wagner. Meyerbeer had helped Wagner early in his career, and Wagner repaid him by slurring him. But Wagner also slurred Robert Schumann. Why? Because Wagner took from Schumann the technique of the leitmotif, the idea of a musical idea which represents a philosophical idea, character, or action in a piece. Schumann had pioneered this technique in his opera Genoveva. And so Wagner's solution was to steal the idea and then to spend his entire life as a critic, writer, and public figure, bad-mouthing Schumann as an orchestrator, as a composer, and as a defective human being. Wagner was ruthlessly exploitive of his friends on a financial level. He borrowed money with no intention of paying it back, so much so that many of the people who helped him ended up in terrible financial duress. He was a bald-faced hypocrite, someone who went from being an anti-monarchical revolutionary as a young man to being completely dependent on the largesse of the King of Bavaria, only to go on and nearly bankrupt the royal family for his own gain. He was a sexual predator and exploiter. He would rather steal a friend's wife than win a woman on his own merits. He destroyed marriages all around him without any hint of regret or hesitation whatsoever. Wagner also exploited men sexually. Wagner himself had a strong, what we would say today, gender fluid side. We don't know if he ever had a romantic relationship with a man, but he was often involved in wearing women's clothing and so on. And in many cases, the gay men in his life, he led them on, he manipulated them, he asked them for money, he exploited them. He was willing to use sexual manipulation to his own end with any person of any gender, regardless of his personal connection with them. His attitude towards Jewish people evolved over the course of his career. Early on, there's not a lot of evidence of anti-Semitism in his activities or his writings, but he would go on later to write the incredibly odious essay on Judaism in music. Again, Wagner's incredible pathological cynicism and selfishness is at the center of a lot of this. For him, anti-Semitism was a tool to exploit. It was an audience base to tap into. It was a base of support that he could galvanize behind him, just as a political leader might see a group of white supremacists as a constituency that they could appeal to. For Wagner, it was a resource to be tapped into, developed, and exploited. His legacy in this sense is completely repugnant. So why are we even talking about this awful, awful person? Well, because he was and remains one of the most important thinkers, artists, musicians, writers in human history. And that's no hyperbole. And what's more, his art isn't just impressive or entertaining or moving. It's art which expresses aspects of the human condition in incredibly important, accurate, original, and powerful ways. And in fact, what he writes about in his operas is incredibly contemporary. So let's take the Ring of the Nibelungen, the work that we're talking about in terms of Mahlerfest this year, this monumental cycle of 4 operas, and look at some of the themes that Wagner examines in this. Wagner, the misogynist in life, is a feminist in art, and one of the central themes throughout The Ring is the exploitation of women. He shines an absolutely unsparing light on this aspect of human nature. From right at the beginning of the cycle, he points this lens of critique on male conduct towards women. The whole cycle begins with Alberic's stealing of the Rhine gold from the Rhine maidens. He approaches them and attempts to seduce them. They reject him, they mock him. He forswears love in order to take possession of the Rhine gold. And in doing so, he violates the Rhine maidens. At the end of this whole huge arc of 4 operas, the final act is that this gold is finally returned to the Rhine maidens. And the instrument of that return, of putting right what went wrong in the beginning, is Brunhilde, the one shining beacon in the Ring cycle. Almost every other character in the cycle is deeply flawed and morally ambiguous. Brunhilde is the sole true hero in the Ring cycle. But just as there are few unequivocally good characters in the Ring cycle, so there are few unequivocally bad characters. Wotan, in particular, is an incredibly interesting, multifaceted character, incredibly selfish as Wagner, you might say, and yet capable of compassion, mercy, self-critique, self-loathing. And it's ultimately him who recognizes the deep corruption of the world and the need for reform. It is him who engineers the downfall of the gods. And let's talk a little bit about this theme of corruption. Wagner's critique of political power is one of the most powerful and interesting in all art. It's right up there with Shakespeare's political plays, I think. And this idea of a political construct, in this case, that of the gods, being so fundamentally corrupt and unjust that it can only be reformed through destruction, is a powerful one. On what is the power of the gods founded? Wotan has Valhalla built on a lie that he would pay the giants for their work, knowing, in fact, he had nothing to pay them with. In an era where we're not so far away from the 2008 financial crisis, the idea of building an empire on debt that you know is going to crumble, that can only crumble, and then trying to salvage that legacy through lies and manipulation. It's very timely, more timely than ever, I dare say. And what is Wotan's solution to this dilemma? It is, again, the exploitation of women. And Wagner's absolutely unsparing in showing the odious nature of Wotan's double dealings here, in offering Freya as a prize in place of payment for this work done. Let's talk a little bit now about Die Walküre, and in particular Act 1, because again, I think it shows us how profoundly relevant Wagner's thinking is for modern audiences. There are only 3 characters in Act 1 of Die Walküre, and then there are other characters who loom large in the background. They are spoken about rather than seen. Those 3 are Siegmund, there's Sieglinde, and there's Hunding. So at the beginning of the act, Siegmund arrives in an unknown house in the woods and begins to tell his story to Sieglinde. He explains that he's fleeing a gang intent on killing him, and he's run out of energy and sought shelter with her. Gradually, he begins to tell what we would now call his backstory. He says that he was raised by a mysterious figure, Wulfa, who we now know is Wotan in disguise, and that he had a sister and a mother, and that he and his father ran rampant over the countryside. They had many exploits and adventures, and after one of these, they returned to the home to find the house burned, the mother murdered, and the sister missing. In the course of this act, it becomes clear that Sieglinde is that sister. And together, Siegmund and Sieglinde first confess their love to each other and then plot to kill Hunding, her husband. It's dark, disturbing stuff. And the more you think about the implications of this plot, the more disturbing it gets. Hunding is not just a wronged husband. He's a monster. He is a monster. It would have been him that murdered the mother of Siegmund and Sieglinde. It would have been him or his associates who stole her. And it would have been him who forced her into a loveless marriage as a child. And how old was she when that happened? How old was she? Throughout Act 1, up until the very end, Sieglinde and Siegmund pretend not to recognize each other. Do they really not recognize each other? If so, how old were they when they were separated? How old were they when they were separated? Yeah? Siegmund tells us that he was old enough to be out on wild adventures with his father before this horrible crime was committed. Sieglinde was apparently old enough to be forced into a marriage, as a child bride perhaps, but not an infant. What happened in those years? Do they really not recognize each other? Does he really not know the house that he's come to? Does he really not know who Hunding is? And then think about the character of Sieglinde, what she's been through. And Wagner is brave and unsparing in showing us her as a victim of sexual violence, as a victim of domestic violence. It's harrowing, it's realistic, it's sympathetic. And he holds that light of unsparing judgment up to Hunding throughout the act. And yet he also shows us the complexity of these two characters, Siegmund and Sieglinde. Are they innocent victims? No, no one is simply that in the Ring cycle. They're both flawed and they're both deeply damaged. The first thing that you often hear about Siegmund and Sieglinde is this notion of theirs as being an incestuous relationship, which it is. But if you replace incestuous with deeply transgressive, if you replace it with incredibly self-destructive, I think then you're on to what Wagner is really depicting here. This is not about breeding a master race. Quite the opposite. It's about two human beings who've been nearly destroyed by the trauma that they've endured, by the things that they've seen and been exposed to, doing what must have been for them the ultimate self-destructive act, one that they knew could only end badly. Throughout the Ring cycle, there's example after example of Wagner showing us both the good and bad in characters, of him showing the horrific things that humans are capable of, and gods for that matter. There is no exalted class. Throughout much of the Ring cycle, there's talk of a great hero, and that will be the child of Siegmund and Sieglinde, Siegfried. Yeah, and when he arrives, he proves to be willful, unintelligent, reckless, selfish, and easily fooled. So in Act 1 of Siegfried, he treats Mima, who's raised him, with incredible derision and scorn, eventually killing him. And then in Götterdämmerung, having won the hand of Brunhilde, the greatest prize of all the lovely ladies of the history of opera, he betrays her. Now, yes, he's drugged, but is he really that stupid? He seems gullible, self-centered, impulsive, and without self-critique. It's only Brunhilde who carries these qualities through the Ring cycle. So the whole idea of the great Aryan hero is critiqued in the Ring cycle. Siegfried is ultimately a failure. The German ideal of heroic striving is actually undermined. Everyone in the Ring cycle who would be the great hero, whether it's Wotan or Siegmund or Siegfried, they're all proved to be failures. All undone by the complex nature of their characters. And in the end, the only thing that can save the world is that the world be cleansed. That Brunhilde brings about the destruction of Valhalla. That the original sin of the Ring cycle, the stealing of the Rheingold, is undone. So what do we do? Do we forget the existence of this music and this thought? Remember that half of what makes Wagner's work important is the words, the ideas. It's not just fantastic music. Do we set that all aside because he was a horrible person? Or do we pretend that his repulsive humanity doesn't matter to us? I would suggest that we need do neither. And that we should instead critique and appreciate and evaluate and condemn where necessary the man and the art separately. Throughout art history, there have been many attempts to conflate the personality traits, the beliefs, or the ethnicity of a creator with the value of that which is created. The Nazis in the 1930s and 40s went to great lengths to try and equate Jewishness with certain undesirable qualities in music. And it's not lost on me the irony that this very critique has in some ways its origins in Wagner's writings. We can look back now and see that for what it was, a completely odious conflation of the artist and the art. And we can see that they were wrong. But one of the things that they were wrong about, I think, is to sort of say that the right kind of art only comes from the right kind of people. Wagner may have believed that, but we don't have to. And in this day and age, it's easy to say that Wagner's personal ideology is so repulsive to us that his philosophical ideas, which may be less repulsive, shouldn't be engaged with. But I think we can judge the two separately. And that I would say that on balance, this body of work is so important, so interesting, and so unique that it's in our benefit, not Wagner's, in our benefit, to continue to engage with it, to discuss it. After all, we not only learn and are inspired and are enlightened by engaging with Wagner's work. Yes, his work helps us to understand other composers. Yeah, his ideas about Beethoven help us to understand Beethoven, a composer who influenced Wagner enormously. Likewise, looking to future generations, we can't really understand the music of, say, Gustav Mahler without understanding the music of Wagner. Mahler was Jewish, and yet he revered Wagner as a composer, especially of the theater. The Second Symphony of Mahler, which we'll be performing at this year's festival, opens with something of an homage to the opening of Die Walküre. That reference wouldn't have meaning if we let history annihilate the works of Wagner. And without Mahler being fully understood and fully realized as a composer, what then of the generation after him, the very composers that the Nazis attempted to ban 20-something years after Mahler's death? We wouldn't understand where they came from. To me, music is very important. Yeah, and let's say, for instance, that we learned that the inventor of penicillin was just as horrible a character as Wagner. Does that mean we shouldn't let humanity benefit from the power of antibiotics? If someone came along with a cure for cancer and we felt that actually the person who did that was an incredibly odious, awful human being, would we not allow that cure to be used? If something's important, then it's for the benefit of all humanity, and we evaluate the person separately. So at what point do we say, enough, we're going to turn our back on the work of a creative person or a scientist or a writer or a thinker on the basis of who they were? I think it's actually not that hard a line to draw. For me, it has to do with harm to society and benefit to perpetrators. Let's take the recent example of James Levine, now known to have been an incredibly vile and manipulative sexual predator. So where does that leave us? I feel that people often, in the case of Levine, go straight to the same thing as Wagner, that we should simply ignore his artistic legacy. I would say that, the correct thing to have done in his lifetime would have been to say, it's important that we don't let his status as a powerful and influential artist allow him to escape scrutiny and justice for what he was doing. Yeah? And that he should have been made accountable for what he was doing during his lifetime. Never mind how rich he was, how famous he was, how well connected he was. Yeah? He shouldn't be protected from accountability. But then what of the artistic legacy? Well, this is where it gets complicated, because Levine, another narcissist like Wagner, and you can think of any number of political figures, media figures who are similarly self-centered. These people tend to build machines of self-aggrandizement around them. Yeah, they push their legacy, they nurture it. So there is often a cult of personality around these people that far exceeds their actual achievements. I think that's true in the case of Levine, which is not to say that he wasn't a talented musician, but one of the things that we look for in musicology is an ongoing sense of critique, and we should by no means spare Wagner's music from that process. Look at it, say, is it as good as people say it is? Is it as important as people say it is? What are the relevances of this work to us today? Look at the work of someone like Levine and say, okay, well, there were great singers on there. The orchestra plays well. Are the interpretations really of the first rank? Are the performances really consistently inspired? People will argue over that over time, and gradually the artistic legacy will settle where it fits most rightly. But it's important that where there is a benefit to a narcissist, where there's a direct benefit to them, I don't think we should allow them to get away with it. Wagner is long dead. His music is in the public domain. No one who helped him in his life is benefiting from our performance. Take, on the other hand, Michael Jackson, recently deceased. The people who benefited from his career are still benefiting from the sales of his records. In that case, I would make the judgment that perhaps our money is better spent elsewhere. But is it really right that someone who's exploited children in the way he seems to have would continue to benefit financially in spite of that, to continue to become more powerful, to have more influence in the media? Let's try to keep our assessment of art and thought and science and ideas focused on those things. Where there is bad behavior, let's address it, hold them accountable through the proper channels. I hope that's been helpful. I'm really excited to be conducting this work again. It's going to be a really powerful performance, I'm sure. And as I said, these ideas are more important and more relevant than ever. So I hope you'll engage with them. I hope you'll join us. And I look forward to seeing many of you at Colorado Malerfest this May.